Okay. All right. So, here, the first question comes from them.
I have two questions. Do I need a microphone or not?
Yes, please wait.
My one question is to Paul Howard, and the other is to Jürgen Wren and Manfred Laubischler. My first question is this. It concerns the historical critical method. Now, when applied in the field of biblical analysis, it means something quite different than when it's applied to the history of science, because the big thing in biblical analysis was to show that the text was written by multiple authors, and therefore it involved close textual analysis. Sometimes we had added to that a contextual history, but that was not the main point of the historical critical method in biblical studies. And I think that has to be seen because the function of text in different disciplines is different. That's question number one. Should I immediately proceed to question number two or wait? Yes. Okay, question number two is this. You know, I'm very sympathetic to what you all are saying. That's Jürgen and Manfred. And yet I have this creepy neo-Rousseauian feeling that there's some kind of nostalgia for a human utopia behind it, because the question is, what is it that we want to survive? Now, you could have a model that you want are surviving, all 7 billion or 8 billion or 9 billion human beings, or however many would be in the future. And you could imagine another model by which we would want our knowledge to survive, in which case you could see that what we have to do is really accelerate our interest in artificial intelligence, move to transferring as much knowledge as we can to machines, and then serenely contemplate a human race with maybe 100,000 or 200,000 people within a couple of centuries. I'm not sure what the balance is between those two models, but I'd like us to think about that.
You're good?
Which question shall I answer? The one on the biblical critical analysis or the one on the human future? I think they're actually related in a way. Because you know, you have to do some concrete considerations in order to realize what it means to go within, you know, a few generations from 7 billion to a couple of 100,000. This means, you know, mass slaughter of humans. This means genocide and all of that. You know, in a long distant future, we can imagine all we want. But, you know, the truth of the Anthropocene is that all of these utopian or dystopian visions are approaching much faster than we were used to in most of human history, where, you know, utopias could be arbitrarily far away. But now they're approaching us, and, you know, with the sea level rising, with climate change, a hothouse Earth system, you know, these decisions come very close to us. And it's clear that the decisions that we are faced with, you know, are decisions that are that shouldn't be made, in my view at least, with a perspective of sacrificing a large part of humanity. So it's, I think, survival of, you know, the species in a biological sense, that will be guaranteed if just a couple of 100,000 are left, and even fewer, because human evolution has gone through some really bottlenecks, as you know, with a very small number of humans alive on the planet. So that's certainly, from a biological perspective, a realistic perspective. But I think that's not what we want. And I think even for the intention to preserve our knowledge, it will be necessary that a large part of humanity will survive this difficult transition, because it won't be so easy to transfer our culture to machines in the period you are talking about. You know, Manfred was raising his phone out of his pocket. You know, we have seen in our lifetime great technological progress, but I think we are far away from these visions that people like Harari are spreading around in airport bookstores, and people are concerned about, you know, will we give up, you know, human life in a short period to machines? That will not happen. So we will have to face the incoming challenges as humans and as a big humanity in terms of numbers. And that's the real problem that we have to solve now. This is not about talking about utopia. That's my answer to your question. So we have to face it now.
So the lesson is that we can't really plan and reach a target utopia. What we do know is that there are some hard boundaries, and Jürgen showed a slide about planetary boundaries, and you might have seen that we are out of bounds on several of those already. So the question is, can we create a space where we at least don't hit those boundaries too much, and whatever then happens will be an open-ended evolutionary process. But we can, from our design principles, say all we can do is try to stay within a space where evolutionary processes can happen on a more, expected level rather than on a catastrophic level. I mean, that's all we can do.
All right, further questions from here? Yes, please.
So this is really to Jürgen and Manfred. I think one of the things that happens if you look at evolution, but I'm no expert, is that parts of it die, species fail. And I'm concerned in your talk about knowledge production about what I would like to suggest we could call knowledge resistance. That is to say, parts of the system that just don't want to know and don't want to accept, and they're very dominant at present, and I need hardly remind you know much more than me. And I didn't explicitly see in your brief discussions of such a lot of work where you account for or deal with the idea that any amount of knowledge can be produced, but the people with the power can simply deny it. And this seems to be a picture of intellectual history, at least from the Enlightenment onwards, that there's always an opposition. And they don't necessarily reason backwards, they back to us, they simply deny.
Denial sounds like an individual move that people have the choice. There is between the denial that is currently going on, for instance, in the discussions about climate change, is much more than an individual rejection. It's an industry. There's an industry behind it, and I think it's part of the history of science. That at least was my argument. And I'm following here people like Naomi Oreskes and others and Conway who have made some of this industry transparent to us. That we have to bring it to public attention. What are the mechanisms that are producing disinformation, hiding, keeping knowledge, keeping it hidden away from the public attention, and so on and so forth. So you cannot really. The Enlightenment vision, I think Manfred would agree with me, is not that we want to have. We think of an enlightened government world government that would all do of these things. So this is all about processes, and the process that we are suggesting is, first of all, study these things because they are important and they are complicated, and they need knowledge about political and economic mechanisms as well as about cognitive mechanisms as we are used to studying them in the history of science, and make them publicly available. And publicly available means, all the things that we have talked earlier about in this conference, making it understandable out of sort of the academic ivory towers. But I think it also means, creating a new knowledge economy in the sense of, new models of publications, a web with open science. It kind of trickles down to political agendas, which are much more mundane than these big pictures of global changes. So it's the daily fight of getting information out there that is accessible to people, and that's the way that I see it. And sort of a last word, because talking about global changes, global government, and the big players, and so on and so forth. I think complex systems theory teaches us also that things on a smaller than global scale can have global effects, and therefore what communities do, what cities do, what states like California are doing in certain areas in contrast to what the nation does, can have an effect, and even a global effect. So I think that's the difference also to this Enlightenment model. I think we shouldn't talk about a preconceived hierarchy where the global level has to be dealt with separately from the lower levels. I think there are kind of cross-scale effects.
Newton and Royal Society and things like that. So in the models that we do about modeling those complex social systems for transformation, you build what's called an agent-based model, and not going into the details. But it actually, when you then present that model in those public engagements, the model has a perspective that the people can identify or see themselves in the model. And with this kind of transparency, you get more trust than if you have some systems of differential equation where you don't know what happens. And it's a question of what is actually allows the public to accept the result of a modeling exercise. So we are going to those foundational questions of what is expertise, who needs to be a witness in those processes, and if you make that transparent, you get the buy-in of even skeptical people. So it's a very interesting thing that goes back to questions from the age of Newton in a way. What does it mean? Who has to witness it? When do you believe the results? So those are foundational questions that come out of it.
We've got time for a final question.
Okay, this is for Marius. If classical mechanics could talk, it would say, what kind of crisis? We were doing fine for 200 years without you. And what would you say to that? You meaning philosophy. I mean, I think sciences proceed quite often with foundational problems. They advance to a point, and then people have to come and resolve these. So in what sense is it a crisis? Well, you can go to the front.
This is your place. All right. Oh, okay. One is, so I'm not the first person who has noticed that, fluid dynamics was proceeding along two tracks at least until Prandtl, until the Grenzschicht theory of 1904. There was the near metaphysical theory of a fluid that can never obtain inviscid fluids. So there was no empirical evidence for the behavior or the correctness of the, Euler equation for that fluid because, we don't have dry water. And there was this, bottom-up engineer, hydraulic engineer, practical knowledge, derived practical knowledge of how actual fluids might behave when you have, when you let them track them over more than a few instants, more than short periods of time. Another one is that, another answer, what I left out of the picture is that the makers of mechanics themselves sometimes feel the pressure of explaining where in God's name does truth come into the theory that we're building so beautifully. So you get people from D'Alembert to Ampere around 1825 trying to derive the dynamical laws by a priori or non-empirical, avenues because they know that there is no empirical evidence for them. So they seek to either prove them from metaphysics, from the principle of sufficient reason. There is a line of, of course, fruitless efforts to show that the principle of virtual work, which after Lagrange moves to Paris becomes the fundamental law of mechanics, that it's true, but not for empirical reason. It's true because of, let's see what else could yield the principle of virtual work. And you also see, again, things that I left out of the picture. You see people like D'Alembert or the Laplacians trying to argue that there's a particular type of material object that is the canonical object of that theory. For D'Alembert, it was the rigid body. For these Laplacians, it was something that we still haven't fully elucidated, if there were tiny, squishy, finite-size molecules, or if they're really mass points. But even they feel the force, the pressure of these questions of trying to answer just on what ontological and epistemic foundations does this theory rest, for God's sake, once they get enough equations of motion. So I didn't mean to say that mechanics stopped making progress because it gave up on metaphysics and epistemology. That wasn't my suggestion. But at least in the ways that the best practitioners of this discipline, the builders, the founding fathers and some mothers, talked about, it was a theory with, a privileged ontology and truth values. It wasn't undecided or fiction. It was true. not false. But if you ask them, like, make good on it, you say these things, but, you know, where's the collateral? They had nothing.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you all for this exciting session. We reconvene here in about 20 minutes. Oh, okay. In an hour. All right. Have a nice lunch. See you later.